thank you everyone who is coming in. Welcome to the future of grant fundraising. Margit, if you would advance the slide, that would be great. For those of you who don't know me, I am Sherry Chaney Jones, and I am the president and founder of Sure Impact. Sure Impact is a B2B cloud-based software platform that helps nonprofits better measure, track, and communicate their unique impact. And as many of you know, and as we will be talking today, the more impact data a nonprofit has to share with their funders, the more likely they are to raise more money. But that is not why we are here today. Today, we are here to learn from my new friend and colleague, Margit Brazda Poirier. And let me tell you a little bit about Margit and why I asked her to come and do this webinar with us, because I know that she has so much good information to share with us. So she is the owner and founder of Grants for Good LLC. You can learn more about her at grantsforgood.com. And she founded the company in 2009, which I love because I formed my first company, Measurement Resources, in 2008. So we've been right around this entrepreneurial journey around the same time. But her goal is to help nonprofits find and get grants. She's one of the only 400 certified grant professionals and one of only 30 approved trainers in the United States and Canada in this profession. Margit and her team have written and received millions in grants from federal, state, foundation, and corporate sources, and she has a unique perspective of understanding both grant seeking and grant making, given her experience leading a prominent New York foundation. In addition to her grant development, she is in high demand for public speaking, as we will see today, doing national webinars, customized trainings for boards and staff. And she's a nationally published author and frequent speaker on all aspects of grant development. So her passion is teaching others about the power of grants through her online course, allaboutgrantwriting.com. And you will want to check that out, and we'll share more about that later. And we're just super excited to have you here with us today to share all of the knowledge that I know you're going to share today. So Margit, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Sherry. And I am so glad that our paths crossed. It's always exciting to meet another entrepreneur, another woman entrepreneur as well, and just to see where our paths have gone. And the wonderful thing about our work is it's so complementary. You'll hear a little bit more about that throughout the webinar. But what I really want to talk about today is the future of grant funding, because by knowing a little bit of what's coming in the future, you can be prepared today and maximize your chances of getting grant funding. So that is my goal, is to help you do that today. One other housekeeping item is everybody on mute. I'm not sure if all of our participants are, but that's always helpful, because you know how it is with tech. You get the occasional dog barking, and then we want to know what breed dog it is, and so on and so forth. So let's do that. And let's also do a quick poll. I love to know who's in the room, which we did through our chat. I also like to know, what is your experience with writing grant proposals? So I'm going to launch this poll. And are you either completely new to this, or perhaps you've written some grant applications, but you haven't quite gotten what you'd hoped for, or you've written some, oh, that's interesting. Whoever wrote the poll doubled the questions. The third one should really read, well, let's just go with what we got here. You're either new or you've done some grant applications, and let's see what we've got. We'll let those up. I'll give it another few seconds. And it looks like about 20 to 25% of folks on this call are completely new to grant writing, and the rest have done some kind of grant writing, but didn't quite get what they'd hoped to get from grants. That's not uncommon. I find that in most of the webinars I teach, people are typically brand new, have no idea even how to find foundations, where to start, or they have done some grant writing, but still don't quite know how to maximize their success. So today's outcomes, here's what we're going to do in the next hour, less than an hour actually, because we're going to have time for questions and answers as well. I want to talk about the current state of grant funding. What's happening right now in grant funding? I also want to look at what are the current trends and what's the future of grant funding hold for us. And finally, things you can do now to get the grant in 2023 and beyond. Oh, I do want to tell you there's a bonus at the end. So I think we're getting our tech issues fixed now. Let's keep going and stay tuned for our bonus here at the end. And again, if you're just joining us, my name is Margit Brazda Poirier. I'm with Grants for Good. I started this grant writing consulting company back in 2009 to help nonprofits and also grant consultants get better at their work, get that grant funding. So because we took a poll and I see that some people are brand new to grant funding, I just want to cover a couple of quick basics. And what is a grant? That's the first question I often get is what exactly is it? Simply put, it's money you don't have to pay back. It does come with certain stipulations. It's money for a specific purpose, but it is money you don't have to pay back. So it's very different from a loan or a line of credit. The other thing to know about grants is that most of them are highly competitive, which is why I teach webinars, which is why I have an all about grant writing online course, because people need to know you want to be at the top of the heap when it comes to these grants. Oftentimes, only 5% or 10%, sometimes only 1% of all grant applications get funded by a particular funder. So you may say, well, those are terrible odds. Why should I do this at all? And the reason why you should is that, first of all, you can be among the top applicants and get grant funding. I'm going to share some data with you in a moment. But the second reason that you don't want to overlook grant funding is that it's an incredible source of revenue stream, and grants can fund just about everything, depending on what the funder says they'll fund. But let me just put it into one big pot. Grants can fund your staff, current staff, and any new people you want to hire. They can fund equipment you might need, perhaps some training for your staff. They can fund your travel, your insurance costs, your supplies, your rent, your overhead, just about everything. The only caveat is you've got to do your research, find the right funders that will fund the very things you're looking for. Whether it's funding a program like an after-school mentoring program, or your general operating costs, which is the golden goose egg. Everybody wants general operating costs. What that means is it covers everything from your insurance, your lights, your air conditioning, your heating, depending on where you are in the country. And also capital costs, which are things like building expansions, renovations, purchase of land, major equipment. So you can see why grants as a revenue source are really, really important. So let me talk about current trends. What's going on right now in our grant funding world? Well, I've got great news. The current climate is still looking really good despite inflation, despite recession over the last few years. The latest data that we have that's aggregate is from 2021. It did show that more than 485 billion was given in grants and donations to charity in 2021, and about 10 billion, over 10 billion in Canada. And that comes from Giving USA. You can check that out. What it shows is that from 2020 to 2021, there is a 4% increase in giving. But if you adjust that for inflation for those 2 years, the giving was relatively flat. Okay, so people didn't suddenly say, wow, I'm going to give a lot more. I'm going to increase my giving. Not really. They did to some extent, 4%. But again, in terms of the effect on nonprofits, it was relatively flat because there was inflation. Now, I don't have the data on this slide, but we all know that 2022 and even right up until today, inflation has skyrocketed. It's been anywhere from 6 to 8%, depending on which time frame you look at and which data. But when you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 6 to 8% inflation is pretty major. And it'll be interesting to see what the data shows in terms of the foundation giving and how it's met up with that. So we'll see. Stay tuned on that. Now, good news. There are more than 100,000 grant-making foundations in the US, many in Canada, and thousands of state and federal grants and provincial federal grants in Canada as well. So you've got your foundation grants, you've got corporate grants, and government grants to choose from. So let's talk about that a little bit, because it's important to know what kinds of funding sources that you can be pursuing. Government grants are ones that, and I'm going to really generalize because we have a short time. I jump into this in much greater detail in my All About Grant Writing self-paced online course. But for now, government grants, keep in mind, they can be more competitive than foundation grants on the whole, but they can yield larger amounts of money. Community foundations. These are important not to overlook, as almost everybody here today, hundreds of people are on this call, everybody here probably has a community foundation if you're in the US that services your region. And some of those give out grant funding. I know the one in Rochester, the Rochester Area Community Foundation, does a significant amount of grant making. So it's worth getting to know them. Now, this is where I want to let you know something. I'm going to be referring to a lot of organizations and a lot of links. And if you're anything like me, true confession time, when I watch a webinar, I might be doing my shoulder physical therapy exercise at the same time. I might be stretching, or I might be sitting down and completely focused on the webinar, or I might be in my car. So regardless of where you are, I'm glad you're here. And I want you to know you don't have to worry about writing all this down, because I've got a one-page handout that you will receive tomorrow. And it will have all of these links in there so that you can easily just click on it and go right to things. Okay, so don't worry about writing down the links. And you'll also get a recording of this webinar from Sure Impact soon. The third type of funding source is private foundations. Remember, this is the 100,000 or more private foundations in the US. I'm sorry I don't have the exact number for Canada, but I know it's very significant. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the 5% rule in a moment and why it's important. But you can also check out my grantsforgood.com blog and read about it. And the last of the 4 types of funding sources, this is how I like to organize my funding sources for grants, is corporate foundations. So think about any particular major stores or banks or industry. They likely have a corporate foundation. Walmart is an example, Ford Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, many, many corporate foundations out there, including all the places you probably do your banking. So let's talk, since we're talking about current trends, and I'm going to jump into a little bit of future forecasting with you here right now too. I want to talk about foundation assets and the 5% rule. Some of you have heard of this, and some of you may find this is completely new, but it's an extremely important thing to know about. This rule applies to any private foundation, including the really big one, like the Gates Foundation, biggest one in the US, I believe biggest in the world. And it also applies to the smallest of family foundations. What the 5% rule means is that if you look at the assets that a foundation finished with last year, December 31st, 2022, you look at what their total portfolio or their assets are, you take 5% of that number, and they have to spend 5% of their total assets the following year. Okay, this is often misinterpreted, so I want to be clear on it. It's called the minimum distribution rule. It's developed by the IRS in the United States. So what this tells you, the reason why this is important, is that when you research your foundation funders, and I'm going to show you a real quick way, an easy, free way to do this. When you find a foundation you want to learn more about, let's say the Ford Foundation, you want to see what their assets were in 2022, so you know that they have to spend at least 5% of that in 2023 on charitable distributions, which is the nonprofits, the very organizations, the schools, the hospitals, everybody joining us on this webinar today. They have to spend that kind of money, with minor exceptions. They have to spend it on charitable distributions. So this is important because it allows you to predict what a foundation has to spend. This is also important for predicting future, because if you look at how the stock markets performed in 2020, 2021, and last year, and even now, you can see if they're going up or down as a trend, and it gives you that insight as to how much will foundations have to spend at minimum. Okay, so during COVID, 2020 was a surprisingly good year on the stock market. A lot of people's assets increased, so that in 2021, their 5% distribution was higher than it was the year before. Now, let me get out my crystal ball here, another jump into the future. There's a trend happening right now by a lot of nonprofit advocacy groups to advocate for increasing that 5% minimum distribution rule. Why? Because we need it now. The organizations, everybody on this call is probably saying, well, yeah, it's great that foundations, maybe want to be here in perpetuity, but with inflation skyrocketing, with a high demand for general operating costs, we need more, we need more funding coming in. And one way to make that happen is to change the minimum distribution rule so that they have to give out 10% or more. So that's something that's in the works right now. I don't know how long it will take to make that change. I suspect it will happen, but change can be very slow at the policy level. Keep an eye out on that, though, where I am hoping for that 5% to go up, because I find that's a very low minimum. Okay, how to find out about a nonprofit, or I'm sorry, about a foundation that you want to research, whether it's a corporate foundation or a private foundation. And don't let the word private turn you off, because Gates Foundation is considered a private foundation because it came from private funding, but it is public in terms of you can apply to it. So if we look at, for example, the Max and Marion Farish Foundation, you can look at the IRS 990. That is their tax return. It is public information. Every foundation's tax return is public information. Now, with corporations, it's a different story. They don't have to disclose, but foundations do. So you can see what the fair market value of all their assets are at the end of the year. And it looks like it's close to $300,000. Sorry, $300 million is how they finished 2019. So if you take 5% of 300 million, calculate that, and you know the minimum that they have to give out in the following year. Okay, so simple equation. Now, where to find grants and funders. So I love to teach webinars solely on this. In fact, in May, I will be teaching a 1-hour webinar that focuses entirely on where and how to find grant funders. But so if you do get on my email list, and that's on grantsforgood.com, you will know about that webinar. But for now, I want to give you a couple of links that I think are going to be helpful. And they are going to be on the one-page handout that you will receive from Sure Impact very soon. And one is federal grants for the US and also for international funding. You can go to grants.gov. There are 26 US federal grant-making agencies that give out grants. They're all featured in grants.gov. So check that out, subscribe to their free email list. Secondly, private and corporate foundations. These are a little bit trickier because unless you have something in mind, like the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, or maybe a small local foundation in your community, unless you have somebody in mind, you want to do a search to say, who will fund a school district in Prescott, Arizona, and specifically who will fund our job skills training program that we want to start up in our school district. I'm just pulling this off, out of my sleeve here. But let's say that's a program you want to consider. How would you find the funders that would fund that? Well, you would want to try a database tool, and some of these can get really expensive, and some of them have a free level of subscription, just like so many things on the internet. So you can try, there are many out there, by the way, so experiment with what you like. I tend to use Instrumental. It's the one I've been using for the last 5 years, and I like it over many of the other ones out there, even though I do have several subscriptions because that's my job. But if you do want to try Instrumental, even just for a month, you can receive $50 off, and there's a coupon code for you, Grants for Good 888-888-8250. That will also be on your one pager. So check that out if you like. And you can also, I mentioned community foundations. If you want to find out who the community foundation is in your location, there's this great link here on your one pager and on this slide that will pop up a map of the US. I'm sorry for anybody outside of the US here. Pop up a map of the US and you just click on your state and your region and you'll find out who your contact is for those community foundations. It's a pretty fun tool to work with. So that should get you started, I hope, in starting to look for funders and who are the best funders for you. Okay, moving on to the next slide. I want to circle back to some trends and future of grant funding, because that's really what we're here for. It's important to know what's going on now. It's important to know about the 5% rule and how that can predict, how the stock market can predict what's available for funding. But I want to share some trends and things you can do as well to empower you to get this grant funding, because knowing that you work with a nonprofit, I can already make a really safe assumption that you are limited on time. I mean, you usually have a million things on your plate at once. You've got a board of directors that expects things. You probably have an annual big fundraising event. Those take tons of time. And so I want to share with you 3 key things that this is how I always think of in terms of 3 C's that you can help to maximize your funding. Contact, congruency, consistency. I'm always big on keeping things simple. So here are the 3 C's. We're going to talk about them each one right now. First and foremost, this is nothing new. Making contact with funders has always been important and it will continue to be important. So it's not hard for me to predict the future of grant funding by saying that you want to continue building those relationships with funders. And what does that look like? Well, if there are already some people that have funded you in the past, it's really important to not lose touch with them. Email or call them and let them know how you're doing. How did you fare through the pandemic? You know, how has your budget been doing? What kind of new and exciting programs are going on? What's been working well? What hasn't been working so well? So definitely keep in touch with the funders that have been your strongest supporters in the past. Secondly, if there are funders you want to meet but haven't yet, please reach out to them as well. Don't be shy. Ask your board of directors to help if they have any connections with local foundations or with big national foundations. Really, so much of giving and philanthropy is person to person. And so it is important to do your research on the foundations and the corporations, go to their websites, see who serves on their board, and see if you have any connections that you can make. And if you don't, and chances are in most cases you won't, you can still reach out to whoever their director of giving is or their program officer just to ask for a short 5-minute Zoom call or a phone call. It'll probably turn into more than 5 minutes, but it's a chance to really introduce your organization and show that it aligns with the mission of the foundation. So again, if we had more time, I would show you how to do your research first, but definitely be sure you align with the funders you're working with. So many places where you can connect with funders, you know, apart from that database instrumental that I just shared and so many of the other databases out there. There are also some ways to connect with funders, such as where you bank, your place of employment, any kind of networking groups, any professional affiliations you might share, even sports and clubs, social connections. I teach an entire webinar on social media and funders, so I may have to jump in and do one of those again. But in the meantime, check out grantsforgood.com, the blog, and you can look at the article called The Not So Obvious Sources of Grant Opportunities. So a little bit of reading for you after this. So 3 C's, 1, contact, 2 is consistency. This is the only way to make grant funding sustainable for your organization. Because by their very nature, grants typically last about 12 months. There's the occasional multi-year grant, 3 to 5 years. Most of them, you research it, you write the proposal, you get the funding, and then you've got 12 months and it runs out. So in order to get grants, you have to consistently apply and have a pipeline of grants. How many, how often? Here's my general rule of thumb, and you can write this down or log it in your mind. I find that people, my clients, have the most success when they apply to 2 to 3 grants, whether it's foundations or government, 2 to 3 per month. Because what that means is they're going to have a higher chance of receiving the grants. You're going to get those denial letters, everybody does, but you are going to get a lot of grant applications funded. And if you send out about 2 to 3 at minimum a month, you will have a consistent pipeline of funding coming in the door as well. And there's some evidence for this. The 2022 grant seeking report. This is a report that comes out each year. And for the last few years, I've seen a similar trend that when an organization submits only one application, this is across the board, all the organizations that were interviewed, when they submitted only one application in a year, about 66% were awarded one grant. Those aren't bad odds, but they're also not very good. But instead, if you submit 3 to 5 grant applications in a year, that's not a lot. 3 to 5, you can do it. 91% were awarded at least one grant, and it just goes up from there. 6 to 10 applications, 96% were awarded at least one grant. So I share this data with you because I really want to encourage you to pursue this type of funding, grant funding. I know Sherry ran a fantastic webinar last month on the future of fundraising. Check that one out. I watched it before this webinar. And it's great because it covers so many different other sources of revenue other than grants. So definitely check it out. But also don't overlook grants as this incredible source of funding. And the third C is congruency, which is really defined as the quality of agreeing, being suitable and appropriate. All right, what does that mean in grant terms? Well, congruency means you want to align your organization and its programs with the funders and the funding sources you are pursuing. So it's pretty simple when you think about it. Foundations historically have formed for a particular purpose. They have to state that purpose when they form their articles of incorporation. So those are all public information. They're always on the IRS 990 that I talked about earlier in this webinar. But I want to talk about 4 key areas of funding that have emerged since 2020. So just in the last 3 years. And these are very critical in terms of planning your future and how you can best align with funders. The first one is during COVID-19, the worst year of all, 2020 and 2021, we saw a lot of pandemic response grants. They went under a number of different names, but for the most part, we saw foundations say, wow, we are in a major worldwide crisis, and we need to give out as much of our resources as possible so that nonprofits, and in some cases, businesses as well, government agencies, schools, hospitals can stay alive. So there was a lot of influx of grant money into many of the clients that I work with. We saw a ton of pandemic response grants out there. They have really come to almost a dead stop at this point. So hopefully that was something you took advantage of when they were out there. The second big trend that happened since 2020, and this was in part because a number of incidences that happened throughout the country, and that was bringing to light, to the forefront, the issue of racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So many foundations and nonprofits have been addressing I should rather say inequity, racial inequity, as well as DEI over the years, but it really came to a head in 2020 and since then. And what I've been seeing is that a number of foundations really are earmarking funds specifically to addressing inequity, whether it's racial inequity, gender inequity, or people with disabilities. So that's a trend that will continue. I guarantee you it will continue. I've been seeing it happen. And so you may want to rethink, is the work that you're doing now truly, are your programs truly equitable? Are people able to access your programming that may not have been able to access it before? Are you directing some of your programming to ensure that those that were previously marginalized or in more remote communities or in marginalized populations, are they getting access to the services and the programs that you offer? And if not, there's a great opportunity for growing your work and obtaining funding to do exactly that. So that's just one example, but racial equity and DEI, it's a very big trend, long overdue, and you can definitely get funding for increasing, scaling up your work to address that. The third trend I have seen is, and I'm hoping this one continues, I don't have evidence that it will, but I encourage you to continue to ask for general operating funding as well as programmatic funding. And the difference being that when you receive general operating funding, it can be used, these are also known as unrestricted funds. It can be used for your general operating budget to run your organization. Now, I teach this in my All About Grant Writing course too, but I'm going to give you a little trick right now. And this is completely ethical. It's above board. When you are applying for a program funding, like a youth mentoring program, after school program, job skills program, let's say at a school, I'm going to use that same example. And let's say you want to do that, make sure that in your project budget, you really allow for the true cost of running that program. That means including your staff costs, including any kind of prorated insurance costs, maybe costs to have meeting space. Make sure you have all the costs included so that your insurance, your meeting space, your utilities for having the lights on an extra few hours after school closes, make sure that is all covered. Those are part of your general operating costs, and you can do that. And the fourth big trend, and this one is really quite new, is called community-centric fundraising. It's a bit too much to get into here because there's lots of more good stuff to cover today, and I'm looking at our time. But let me tell you about community-centric fundraising. It is a term you're going to be hearing a lot of. In fact, if you just Google that term, put it in your search engine, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff come up. But on that one-page handout that you'll be receiving soon, I have a link that I find is really one of the best links for learning about community-centric fundraising. And here's what it means in a nutshell. It is saying that rather than always having our programs fit the mission of the funder, which is called donor-centric fundraising, we are going to shift and focus strictly on what the community needs, because the nonprofit you work for, the work that you're doing, you really are the expert in knowing what the community needs. And so what you're going to find is you're going to see grant applications on occasion ask you a whole new kind of question, and it goes like this. The question may say something to the effect of, what evidence do you have that the community needs and wants this program? You might see another question that goes like this. How have you involved stakeholders in your community to develop your program? Okay, these are two questions that are showing up in grant applications that never, ever showed up even 5 years ago. And that's because people are jumping into community-centric fundraising. We all want to be sure that the programs out there are truly going to be needed, utilized, and wanted by the very people who are going to be affected. One of the best ways you can do this is get people on your board that represent your target audience. So if you are working with a group to help people with cerebral palsy or other disabilities gain workforce skills, have somebody on your board that has cerebral palsy, that has the kind of disability so that they can speak for themselves and say, well, you know what, I really would like to develop this particular kind of skill, and here's how I would like that to be done. If you do that, you will stand out far and above the rest of organizations applying for grant funding. Believe me on this. It is truly the wave of the future is expand your board reach, bring people into the program. And if you're already doing it, then I'm clapping for you. You're doing fantastic. So those are some key trends. Use those trends. Let yourself rethink about your target audience, who you can reach better. Rethink your programs, maybe even rethink your mission. All right, so I'm going to shift it over to Sherry because she's got some great info to share. And stay tuned because the third part of this webinar, I'm going to give you some quick things you can do now to get grants in 2023 and beyond.
Thank you, Margit. This is so helpful. I've got a whole bunch of notes I've been writing already. But one of the things I really appreciated, which is a good segue into what I'll be sharing, is related to these trends we're seeing related to equity and DE&I, along with the community-based fundraising and the operational support. So these are really, I think, great opportunities and trends for nonprofits, very welcome, especially the operating support. But we also are seeing some trends, just as you mentioned, Margit, about the different questions that are being asked of nonprofits when they're applying for these grants, that with operational support, there's a new set of questions that are being asked of nonprofits more so than ever. And so we need to remember, like we've talked about, that your funders want you, the grantors, they want to partner with you because, yes, they do have to distribute that 5% of funding, but they have a specific mission that they want to achieve or goals they want to achieve. And so they do see this work as a partnership. They see you as the hands and feet of the community that can help them further their mission through the funding that they give you. You can advance to the next slide. And so one thing they want to see, and they'll be asking about in these grant applications, is what is your impact? So Margit talked about, keeping them informed and talking to your particular grantors about how you're doing, what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're involving the community, how your nonprofit is meeting the needs of those in your community. But they also want to see how your participants are better off. How are you changing lives and changing circumstances? Specifically, if you're looking for that operational support, because it is not tied necessarily to program deliverables and program outcomes, they would like to see that your nonprofit has a track record and a history of success at solving the problem that both you and they are looking to solve. And so what you need in order to be competitive and win more grants related to this new opportunities, these new funding sources, is be able to communicate what did you do or what do you do with your participants and beneficiaries, how well you're doing it, do you have metrics related to quality, and then how people are better off. How are you achieving that mission? How do you measure it? How do you define it? And what is your success rate? And that is how these operational support dollars will be able to be given to you. And often grant writers, many of you probably on the call are grant writers. Maybe you're an executive director of a nonprofit or a board member of a nonprofit. You're asked the question, yeah, I'm getting these questions on my grant application that are asking me to talk about what are our outcomes, what are our results, how do I get there? And there's really two ways to get there. Data doesn't magically appear. We have to collect data somehow to be able to answer these stories. And the first is the manual approach to impact measurement. And this is a totally acceptable way to do it. But it does require work. So you can develop your measurement framework. And essentially what that is really outlining those three things. What did we do? How well did we do it? And how people are better off. and linking outcome measures to that. Of course, that whole topic related to how to select the right measures, how to create a logic model, what are the right measures to select. We have so much information and past webinars and past blogs at sureimpact.com on that. So check out our resources page if that's new to you. And then you'll need to figure out, where are you collecting that data? Where do you have that data to answer those questions? You'll need to merge that data to make sense of it so that you can talk to your funders, you can make data-driven improvements and share your story. And we have evidence and research that organizations who engage in this particular process are 68% more likely to raise more money through grant funding. And we have clients who have received $5 million in new funding once they were able to tell their impact story. Next slide, Margaret. But the good news is that Sure Impact came about because we knew that particular manual approach to impact measurement and having data in multiple data sources and spending a lot of time and energy merging that data, analyzing that data to bring it out so that you can tell your story was extremely time consuming. So what Sure Impact did is we automated that. We've created an online platform that takes all of that information, gives you one source of truth to be able to quickly analyze that, and then give you dashboards that you need to be able to quickly tell your story. So when you are applying for those 2 to 3 grant applications a year, or a month, I'm sorry, a month, so you can get to that 10 a year, we know that it can't take you 2 weeks to be able to crunch the numbers to have the data you need to tell your story. You need it at your fingertips so that you can then quickly drop it into your grant application and be off and running and increase your likelihood to raise that money. And so that's essentially what Sure Impact is, and how we help. An emerging trend in grant making is the fact that we now can leverage technology to give us that impact data at our fingertips to be able to help us tell our stories and be more successful at winning those particular grants. So I wanted to just make everyone on the call aware that impact measurement, being able to tell your impact story, is an important element to increasing the impact or your success at grant writing, and that Sure Impact is now a way to leverage technology in order to have those insights and increase the likelihood of you winning those grants. And I'm going to turn it back to Margaret just to give us a little more insight of, okay, so you know what you need to do, you've got your impact data, now what can we do now?
Well, thank you, Sherry. This is one of the reasons why I'm so glad that we met, is because I find that so many people struggle with exactly what you're talking about, and that is showing the impact. And guess what? What are funders really buying? They're buying impact. So if you cannot show the change that you are making and have it supported by data, the chances of getting ongoing funding decrease dramatically. So evaluation truly is one of the biggest challenges that I see in the clients that I have with coaching. And also in the All About Grant Writing course, I help you through that. We work through that. But I love Sherry's model of being able to access that data and save a ton of time. So let's get into the last part of our presentation here, and that is, what can you do now to be ready to get grant funding in 2023 and beyond? And remember, if anything we've talked about today feels remotely overwhelming, think of it this way. When you write your first grant, when you start to find some funders that are a really good fit with you, it gets much easier. Getting that first grant application done is the hardest thing at first, but then you just rinse and repeat. It becomes so much easier over time. So reach out to me anytime, but do not feel overwhelmed, I hope. Here are some things you can do now. I've got a free guide that you can download at my grantsforgood.com site, and it's 7 steps to grant success. I really hope you download it, because not only will you get the free guide, but it also allows you to opt into my newsletter so that you'll get occasional emails saying, guess what? There's another webinar happening in May, and it's all about researching funders. or I might share with you some really important tips that will help you with your next grant application. So check out grantsforgood.com for your guide. And in that guide, I talk about preparing your essential documents. These are things you can gather now before there's ever a grant deadline, because believe me, once you find a good funder, chances are you're going to look at the application, you're going to say, oh my gosh, it's due in 2 weeks. How do I get this done in 2 weeks or less? So I like to subscribe by the proactive method of gathering a lot of your materials now before there's ever a deadline. So those are all, I know we're kind of short on time, so just download the guide. You'll see exactly what's required for nonprofits. These are all your typical documents, your IRS tax return, board of directors list, etc. There are also a lot of optional documents or additional documents. So this is a checklist that is in that 7 steps guide. And finally, I want to talk about a typical grant proposal. And the reason I bring this up is because after, let's see, I started Grants for Good in 2009, and I wrote my first grant application in 1993 on stone tablets. Well, not really, but I wrote it in 1993 before there was a whole lot of internet presence at all. And the truth is that grant applications, although the technology has changed, they're asking for similar things, even in the last several decades. So a needs or a problem statement. This is the whole reason why you're applying. What's the problem in the community? Your organizational capacity. Yes, you've just got to make the case for why your organization is the best one to do this work, or why it can handle grant funding. Your target population, any kind of collaborative partnerships. This has been a big trend in the last decade, by the way, is partnering. It does look better when you apply for a grant to have collaborations. Every grant application needs your program design, your outcomes, your goals, your key personnel, your evaluation plan, thinking sure impact and data here. And finally, your budget and budget narrative is so important because you want to make the case for what's your total project budget and how much are you asking from a funder. So these are things that I see in common with most grant applications, whether they are foundations, corporations, community foundations, or government grants. Remember those 4 types of funding that we covered right at the beginning of the webinar. So my last thing I want to tell you about, and this is the bonus I was talking about, is whenever I teach a webinar like this, people say, okay, Margit, that was great. I know a ton more than I did before, but how the heck am I going to write my first grant application? I need someone to sit right next to me and do this with me. And so that's why I developed All About Grant Writing. It is my self-paced online course that you can purchase one-time, access all 8 modules immediately, and then you can do it at your own pace. You can Netflix binge it, or you can take a year to complete it or more. But basically, the way allaboutgrantwriting.com is designed is so that when you're done with the course with 8 modules, and there's about 10 hours of instructions, just so you know ahead of time, when you're done with that course, you're going to have the skills to raise 6-figure grants or more. And I can say that because I have people in the course that have done exactly that. They've come back to me and they've said they raised $200,000 in the first 6 months during the course, because what the course does is it walks you through everything from researching the best funders to writing every single section of a grant application that I just mentioned, including the budget, and all the follow-up that you need to know about, and a whole bunch of tech tools and templates that will save you time. So in other words, if you want to see a well-written grant application, if you want to see a completed logic model and a budget, it's all there. These are all downloads that come with the course. So my goal with this is I want you to raise the money you need to do the important work you're doing without spending all your time being frustrated or trying to patch together a whole bunch of different YouTube videos. I want you to save time by finding the best grants for you. And I want to be able to help you every step of the way. So I do that by providing you with the grant templates, with a planning workbook, and also with live Q&A. So we have one coming up in April. So if you sign up for the course this month, you'll be jumping into that live Q&A with me where we can talk about your grant proposals and any questions you have. And that's my favorite part of this, is I get to work with you directly. It's not just a course where you sign up and everything disappears except for the online presence. I will be there with you. There's a special discount I'm going to offer you because I'm partnering with Short Impact today. And that is, if you register by March 31st, so you've got about 10 days left, you can get $100 off the course. So remember, the investment is close to $1,000. I have had people make $200,000. So that's a pretty good return on investment. But even better, you can take $100 off the course. And you can do that either in the 3-payment plan or the one-time fee. Totally up to you. It works for both of those. So use the code SURE, S-U-R-E 100 to get your $100 off when you register. Again, that'll be in that one pager as well. And I'm so glad you're here. I wish I could sit down and talk to each one of you personally right now. But the next best thing is we've got some time for Q&A. So let's jump into that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Margit. I'm so excited for everyone on the call today and everything that they've been able to learn today. I think, Laurel, we have a few questions. I've been trying to monitor the chat.
We had a question from Neil. So he said, I have found a lot of grants seem to focus on research-based outcomes data rather than pragmatic strategies which are improving people's lives. It seems like the funders like to fund duplication studies rather than trying something new. So his question is, do you have some recommendations for, breaking the ice on new programs versus just funders funding duplicate studies?
I'm happy to start working on answering that. And Sherry, I'm sure you have insight on this as well. If I understand the question correctly, I think what Neil is finding is that so often, I especially see this in the really large foundations, that they will give big grants to organizations doing work as long as that work is replicable. So as long as it can be created or duplicated elsewhere, because they often, folks like Gates Foundation, Ford, sometimes they want to fund something that you're creating in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as long as it can be applied to other communities throughout the country or internationally. So that can be frustrating. But what I have found is that more often than not, foundations that are located closer to the region in which you are doing your work, in which you're serving your target population, those foundations don't have that requirement. They're happy to fund. Regional foundations, local foundations are usually very happy to fund local programs that make an impact in your community. And that impact can be shown by changes in high school graduation rate, for example, changes in behavior in people, by localized health studies, improvement in health. Again, I'm not sure exactly which type of programs you focus on, but I'm hoping that's helpful. So feel free to pop something else in the chat, and I'll hand it over to Sherry as well on this.
Yeah, thank you. I would just add that I find that funders are interested in funding new innovative projects, but only when those projects are rooted in data. So that's why creating such a data-driven culture in your nonprofit is so important, because then when you're communicating, you're building those relationships, specifically with more of the local, just like Margit said, the local community foundations, you're able to talk to those grant officers about why your new innovative project is likely, if you haven't yet implemented it, would likely produce the outcomes that you say that it will, because you're grounded in data or learning or research. And so, or if you are not, and it's a theory or you have a hypothesis, it's best to then have that evaluation plan that's often called a demonstration study, and you can get demonstration grants for it, where you have an evaluation plan where you are very clear on how you will measure success to increase the learning of that particular innovation. Looks like we do have a few more questions let's see.
Okay, so we'll go ahead. So one from Lilia. On average, how soon are 990 forms available after the end of the calendar year? Do foundations have a specific deadline to submit their 990 forms?
I used to work for a foundation. I was the executive director of a foundation here in New York, and we had to submit, our accountants rather, had to submit the 990 form for the tax deadline for foundations, which was May 15th, I believe, in most years. So instead of April 15th, it was May 15th. So I think what you're asking is, how soon can I see that 990 data, right? You want to know what's the latest data on the foundation you're researching. And I have found it varies, because you figure if a foundation submits all their tax data by May 15th, and then it takes a while for it to be published publicly by the IRS. I don't know an exact date. I don't know if you do, Sherry, but I would say today your best IRS data would probably be from 2021. And again, it depends when their tax year or their fiscal year ends. But I would say trust the data from 2021. That should be available now. And at some point this summer, data from 2022. That's my best estimate.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It's like,
Okay, so one more question. What can you do to raise seed money as you wait to receive your 501c3 application's tax exempt status?
What can you do to raise seed money as a way? Okay, so this is kind of a chicken and egg syndrome here, Elizabeth. I'm glad you asked this, and welcome, by the way. I'm glad you're on this call. Most foundations, private foundations, when they form in their charter, it usually states that they can only fund organizations that have 501c3 status in the US, which means they are nonprofit tax exempt. So even if they wanted to give you seed money, to get started and up and running, they can't. Their hands are tied. So for that kind of fundraising, I would almost suggest holding fundraising events and going for individual donors. So you could research foundations and see who is on those foundations and see if they want to make a donation on their own beforehand. And I'll give you one more. Oh, I love this tidbit. Here's one more insider information here. A lot of foundations, their board members often have discretionary funding. So in other words, they may not get paid to be on the board, but they might receive, let's say, $5,000 or more each year to contribute to their charity of choice. Well, you could be that charity of choice. So it's still worth reaching out to foundations to introduce yourself and what you're all about, even before you have your 501c3. But explain to them that that they cannot give you a formal grant until you have your 501c3. And good luck with your startup.
well, thank you very much. I know we have a lot of questions, but we are at the end of time, and I do want to basically respect everybody's time. So we will take the questions that we haven't addressed. We will definitely follow up with a follow-up email with this recording, the handout that Margaret talked about, some more information about Sure Impact. And then right there on the slide, you have our email addresses. So please feel free to send us an email and ask us those questions. We're happy to talk to you. Don't forget all about grant writing course and the special offer for being on this webinar today.
And Alicia Gregory can reach out to me. She's got a question. Is there a group discount if there's 4 people from the same organization? Yes, there is. Please pop me an email. Thanks.
Oh, awesome. Great question, Alicia. Okay, well, thank you so much. I hope everyone has an absolutely wonderful day. Our next webinar will be on April 27th, the relentless pursuit of impact. We'll be talking about some leadership traits and the importance of an entrepreneurial mindset. Yes, entrepreneurial mindset in your nonprofit, and what that is and why that's so important. So hope to see you at that upcoming webinar. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Margit, so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Great to work with you on this, and wonderful to meet some new people and see some familiar faces on our webinar. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'll look forward to talking to you all soon. Have a great week. Bye.